Good evening. We are still in the Jacob story, and just a little recap. Jacob is the son of Isaac, who is the son of Abraham. Abraham had two sons, Ishmael, the oldest, and Isaac, his youngest. And in that day, all the rights and promise and inheritance went to the older son. But God doesn't choose as we choose. And so the promise was destined to be lived out through Isaac, the younger son. Isaac married Rebekah, and they had twin sons. The first was Esau. He was born first, and that made him the older son with all the rights and privileges. Jacob was born second, and he was born grasping his brother's heel, which kind of became his whole persona, always grasping to get ahead, kind of the deceiver, the one who will take the shortcuts. And in fact, he would take shortcuts and deceive his brother out of his birthright. And later, it would be Jacob and his mother Rebekah who deceived Isaac into giving the family blessing to Jacob rather than Esau. Esau was furious. He had lost his birthright and his inheritance and the blessing from his father. And so he vowed that after his father died, he would kill Jacob, which of course, after his father died and he killed his brother, would return and restore all of his inheritance back to him. Rebekah caught wind of that plan, and so she sent Jacob off to their homeland, back to the old country, to find a wife and to be safe from his brother Esau. So continuing in Genesis chapter 29. Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. And he looked, he saw a well in the field, and lo, 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it. For out of that well the flocks were watered. The stone on the well's mouth was large. And when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place upon the mouth of the well. Now remember, meetings at wells are usually good places to find a wife. We've seen that throughout Scripture. This is a meeting place in the ancient times. It would be a gathering place because people would be drawing water for household needs, but also for their flocks, as in the case of this well. This well had a rock covering it, which they would. You wanted to cover it so nothing fell in and contaminated the water. But the rock covering it was so large that it required more than one person to move the rock. And so they would wait till all the shepherds and their flocks gathered. They would move the rock and water all the flocks at the same time and then recover it. Jacob said to them, "My brothers, where do you come from?" They said, "We are from Haran." He said to them, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" And they said, "We know him." He said to them, "Is it well with him?" They said, "It is well. And see, Rachel, his daughter, is coming with the sheep." He said, "Behold, it is still high day. It is not time for the animals to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go, pasture them." But they said, "We cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well, and then we water the sheep." Now think of what was happening. Jacob sees Rachel approaching the well, and yet all these other shepherds, all these sheep and goats are surrounding the well. And he's a young man. He's ready to meet a prospective bride, and he's ready for the other shepherds to leave. So he moves the rock from the well, and it shows off his strength to the other shepherds and to Rachel. While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. Now when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman, and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. When Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him a month. Now we're going to see that Jacob really meets his match in Laban. But one of the things, even in the midst of all the bad family dynamics, one of the things I really appreciate is this foundation of the importance of family. Can you imagine meeting somebody for the first time and them saying, "I'm your long lost cousin. I've never met you before," and then inviting them back to your home where they can live with you for a month. That makes me nervous just thinking about it. But there is something about valuing your loved ones. No matter how much time has passed, connect with them. And so I hope that you'd think of somebody that maybe you've lost touch with. What's a way that you can reach out and connect with them, especially during this time? Give them a phone call or drop them a little note of encouragement. It's never too late to make a... Continuing on in Genesis chapter 29, verse 15. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful and lovely. Now scholars debate what the phrase means when it describes Leah as saying her eyes were weak. Some go as far to try to correct the situation and say that her eyes were lovely, but that doesn't seem to hold because it really puts one sister's traits against the other, and Leah's seemed to be on the losing side. So it might have been that her eyes were weak, her ability to see, and maybe she was squinting and that was unattractive, or maybe it was a nicer way of saying that looking at Leah made your eyes weak, that she was that unattractive. Either way, it described Leah as having this negative attribute, but Rachel was beautiful and lovely. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, that I may go into her, for my time is completed." So Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. But in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" So Jacob the deceiver gets played. Now, in that time for the wedding ceremony, the women probably would have been veiled, and the lighting in the tent that night was probably not very good. And so it wasn't until morning that Jacob discovers that he had been with the wrong wife. Laban said, "It is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years." Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. So a sad beginning to Jacob and his wife's relationship. Leah was deceived as well as Jacob, and Rachel came along and was the second wife. You can see that things are not going to be good in this family. Continuing on with Genesis chapter 29, verse 31. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Now, whenever you have a woman who's described as barren in the Bible, it's a phrase that should clue you in that a special birth story is going to happen. It's kind of like when you're watching a movie and the soundtrack of the movie gives you hints as to what's about to take place. If you're watching a scary movie, a lot of times you'll hear the scary music long before the scary thing happens. And that's what the phrase, this woman was barren, clues you in. Something special is going to happen. What's interesting is that God will not forget the other. Even though Rachel was loved and she was barren, God remembered Leah and gave her children as well. It says that God opened her womb, meaning she had her own special birth story that was brought about by God, in addition to the birth story we know will take place with Rachel. And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. What a sad thing to read. Leah had given birth to her first child and should have been full of joy. But all of her thought was about the fact that her husband didn't love her. She conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Again, she conceived and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will be joined to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. Now I feel terrible for Leah. She had these sons with Jacob, but her heart was yearning for his love. She called her children names, her sons names that reflected her anguish. Hopefully now my husband will love me. God has looked upon me because I'm hated. Now my husband will be joined to me. But finally, after the 4th son, her focus shifts to God, and she expressed her gratitude back toward God, that she would praise God even in the midst of not feeling loved. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister, and she said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you in the fruit of the womb? Now, this just angers me against Jacob. And truthfully, there's a lot in Jacob's life that you can get angry about. But for this woman, Rachel, his wife, in that day, a woman's worth was tied to her ability to have children. And if a woman didn't have children, if a woman was barren, they were ridiculed, they were made fun of, and it was seen as a curse from God. And so when Rachel cries out to her husband, give me a child, instead of comforting her, instead he joins in the ridicule. And he says, am I in the place of God? God's the one who has withheld from you a baby. So he is reaffirming this society's notion that it's Rachel's fault. Now, when Rachel cries out, "Give me a child or I shall die," she's not just being overly dramatic. The fact was that if a woman never had children, not only would she be ridiculed all of her life, accused of being cursed and unloved, forgotten by God, when her husband died and she became a widow, she would have no means of support because she had no children. And so she would be left to beg in that society. It was a shameful thing. And it was the reason why throughout Scripture, God continually admonished the Hebrew people, remember the widows and orphans among you. So who is it that are the widows and orphans of today's society? Who is it that are ridiculed, cast aside? Who is it that are the forgotten of our world today? What is it that God calls us to do for the widows and orphans now? What is a tangible way that we can reach out to them and make a difference? Continuing on with Genesis chapter 30, verse 3. Then she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her that she may bear upon my knees, and even I may have children through her." So she gave him her maid Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged me, and has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Now this is reminiscent of what happened with Abraham and Sarah. Remember, Sarah was barren, and so she gave Abraham her handmaiden Hagar to have a son. Now this was a common practice in that day. You could have a child through your maid. They would be kind of a surrogate, and then the child would be seen as yours. In the case with Hagar and Sarah, it turned out different. Ishmael, the son of Abraham by Hagar, was never considered to be Sarah's son. Now maybe that's because Hagar kind of claimed the status of a wife and Ishmael would always be hers, or maybe it's because when the child was born, Sarah, in fact, rejected Ishmael and never claimed him as her son. But this would be different with Rachel and Leah. They would both have children by proxy through their maids and would claim those children as kind of a check in their win column. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, "Good fortune." So she called his name Gad. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, "Happy am I, for all the women will call me happy." So she called his name Asher. Now the tables have turned. Now Leah has become barren. Now she is finally displaying happiness. But I have a feeling it's not really that she's happy. I think she's retaliating against Rachel, who declared that even though she had 2 sons to Leah's 4, she claimed herself to be the one who prevailed in the fight with her sister. And that was because she knew that Jacob loved her and not Leah. And so when Leah says, "And now all women will call me happy," I think that's a jab back at Rachel, because she's really saying all women will call me blessed. All women will call me the winner. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Give me, I pray, some of your son's mandrakes." Now, mandrakes are a plant of the nightshade family, and they had medicinal properties, some narcotic properties, and in ancient times were thought to be an aphrodisiac because the roots of the plant kind of resembled a human body. And so they were out looking for mandrakes in order that they might conceive and have children. And Rachel wants the mandrakes from Reuben, and here is Leah's response. But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" Rachel said, "Then he may lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. Now, Rachel had most of Jacob's time, but she herself had not had any children. She'd only had children through her maid. And so Leah had these aphrodisiacs, and Rachel wanted them. And so she said she would allow Leah to spend one night with Jacob. And so Leah met her husband at the field. Why? Because otherwise he would have gone straight to Rachel's tent. And she met him in the field and said, "Look, you have to sleep with me tonight. I bought you, and so it's my turn." And so they return to her tent. This shows you just the depth of family issues that are going on. The sisters are fighting. Now, surely it was Laban who started this conflict, but Jacob didn't help it. He really kind of stoked the fire. He kept them competing against each other. He was obvious in his love for Rachel and his rejection toward Leah. And this would continue on, and it would be passed on. Imagine the children that are growing up in the midst of this conflict. Are there any areas of conflict in your close relationship? Where do you need to be about reconciliation and healing? Problems don't resolve themselves. Address them because it's too important. Continuing on in Genesis chapter 30, verse 17. And God hearkened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has given me my hire because I gave my maid to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good dowry. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons." So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." And she called his name Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add to me another son." Rachel finally bears a son. She named him Joseph and said that the Lord had taken away her reproach. Again, what a tragic thing in that society for women to be ridiculed in the midst of their desire to have a child and not be able to. All those around them would ridicule them and accuse them of being forgotten by God. And so she's talking about this reproach, but I suspect that the reproach she's feeling is not so much from a community at large, but rather her sister Leah. When Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know the service which I have given you." But Laban said to him, "If you will allow me to say so, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it." So after Joseph is born, Jacob wants to return home to his birthplace. Laban has made a fortune off of all of Jacob's work. And so he tries to talk him into staying and says, look, we'll renegotiate. What wages do you want? I'll name your price. I'll pay it. Jacob said to him, you yourself know how I've served you and how your cattle have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly. And the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also? He said, what shall I give you? Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again feed your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later when you come to look into my wages with you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen. Laban said, good, let it be as you have said. But that day Laban removed the he-goats that were striped and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in charge of his sons. And he set them a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. Now, Laban had made this agreement with Jacob, but we know that Laban's just as much of a deceiver as Jacob is. So he took away all the animals that should have belonged to Jacob, and he hid them with his sons. Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane, and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the rods. He set the rods which he had peeled in front of the flocks in the runnels, that is, the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the rods, and so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped, and all the black in the flock of Laban. And he put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob laid the rods in the runnels before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the rods. But for the feebler of the flock, he did not lay them there. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man grew exceedingly rich, and had large flocks, maidservants and menservants, camels and asses. Both men, Jacob and Laban, were back and forth trying to get the best of each other. Laban had sent the flocks away that should have been Jacob's, but at least it was Jacob's own work and kind of rudimentary genetic breeding program that grew his own livestock. Continuing with Genesis chapter 31, verse 1. Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has gained all his wealth. And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where the flock was, and said to them, I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I've served your father with all my strength. Yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the cattle of your father and given them to me. In the mating season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the he-goats which leaped upon the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift up your eyes and see. All the goats that leap upon the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go forth from this land, and return to the land of your birth. Then Rachel and Leah answered him, Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has been using up the money given for us. All the property which God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do. So here, Laban had originally gotten the best of Jacob, but also his daughters. He tricked Jacob into marrying Leah when he thought he was marrying Rachel. But now the daughters accused their father of never paying the dowry, the bride price that was due them. Instead, their father squandered the money and spent it on himself. So Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he drove away all his cattle, all his livestock which he had gained, the cattle in his possession which he had acquired in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's gods. Now, the household gods that Laban had would have been a sign of his authority over his own household. And so for Rachel to steal them doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to continue this polytheism, believing in multitude of gods. She probably did it to get back at her father, that he was able to, instead of paying 2 bride prices by marrying his daughters to 2 different men, he was able to kind of get rid of them with one man, and then he denied both of them their dowry. And so she snuck in and took away this symbol of his authority, the gods that were supposed to watch over Laban and his household. She deceived her father, who was supposed to look after her. It goes back to this deceit that Laban and Jacob and the daughters are practicing. Remember when Esau was denied his blessing because of Jacob's kind of treachery and his mother's treachery? He was tricked out of it, and Esau proclaimed, now, doesn't his name fit him? He is the deceiver. What is the name that we carry through life? What does our reputation say about us? Is it something good, so that when somebody finally deals with this, they say, I've heard about you, and your name, your reputation fits you? Be the person you want to be. Continue with Genesis chapter 31, verse 20. And Jacob outwitted Laban the Aramean, in that he did not tell him he intended to flee. He fled with all he had and arose and crossed the Euphrates and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. When it was told Laban on the 3rd day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsmen with him and pursued him 7 days and followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, Take heed that you do not say a word to Jacob, either good or bad. And Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen encamped in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, What have you done, that you have cheated me and carried away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and cheat me, and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs and tambourine and lyre? And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm, But the God of your father spoke to me last night again, or saying, take heed that you speak to Jacob neither good or bad. Now it's interesting that Laban admits God said, don't speak a word to Jacob, either good or bad. And yet Laban is having this huge speech accusing Jacob of all these things. And now you have gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? Jacob answered Laban, because I was afraid, for I thought you would take your daughters from me by force. Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours and take it. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the two maidservants, but he did not find them. And he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat upon them. Laban felt all about the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me. So he searched, but did not find the household gods. Then Jacob became angry and upbraided Laban. Jacob said to Laban, what is my offense? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? Although you have felt through all my goods, what have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between the two of us. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your she-goats have not miscarried, and I have not eaten the rams of your flocks. That which was torn by wild beast I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. Of my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. Thus I was, by day the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and my sheep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. So we're in the midst of this conflict between Jacob and Laban and between the daughters and their father. And although both men are clearly deceiving each other and trying to get the best, it's also obvious that of the two, Jacob is the one who is the producer. He's the one who worked to make it happen. And God was on his side. God would continue the promise of Abraham through Jacob. Thank you for joining in, and I hope you will have a great rest of the day, and I hope you will join in next time.